This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. We're going to talk about a polarizing subject for brewers today, maybe one that shouldn't be as polarizing as it is, but certainly if you were to hop onto social media and ask a bunch of brewers what they thought about hard seltzer, you'd get a mixed bag of opinions. My guest for this conversation today is Chris Colby, who has just authored a new book for Brewers Publications called How to Make Hard Seltzer. Chris has written for us in the past at Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
Getting information about how to make hard seltzer, it's been an interesting one. It's hard to pry some of the more interesting secrets out of folks that are making it these days. And so there's not a lot of knowledge out there around how to do it. We're going to talk in this episode about just that. Before we do, nearly 2,000 breweries across the US, Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and more trust G&D to chill the beer that you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, brewers seeking amplifying malt and distillers hunting down delicious base options welcome Gambrinus rye malt as their malt choice. This rye malt gives spicy, grainy, and bready notes with suggestions of vanilla and sweet dough. It strengthens mouthfeel, viscosity, and head retention combined with flaked oats or wheat for IPAs, and is a solid base for a wide range of distilled spirits. Learn more about Gambrinus rye malt at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact BSG at 1-800-374-2739. So, Chris, you've got a long history of writing and sharing information and curating information and pulling things together for those in the brewing space. Walk me through a little bit of your history in writing and covering the world of craft beer.
Well, I've been a home brewer since graduate school. I think I started in about 1991 and homebrewed for many years. Started out, I was in a tiny little apartment in Boston. Started out, doing extract beers because it was just easy. And at that point, I had enough difficult stuff in my life, in science and graduate school that, something that was easy and ended up with beer was a great hobby. Eventually switched sort of via partial mashing into all grain brewing. And then later I moved with my wife to Bastrop, Texas, which is near Austin. And I worked at an educational publishing firm for a while, and I started writing for Brew Your Own magazine at that time. That turned into being an associate editor, and that turned into being the editor for a while. Now I have my own website, beerandwinejournal.com, and I've been mainly focusing on my freelance writing in the past couple of years, which is mostly brewing, but also a little bit of gardening, a little bit of cooking, a little bit of other crazy hobbies of mine. So that's my basic career in writing. I've published 3 books, 2 via Page Street, Homebrew Recipe Bible, and Methods of Modern Homebrewing. And I just wrote my first book for the BA, How to Make Hard Seltzer. And I should have another book through BA, Brewers Association. I should have one out in 2021 too on brewing and science.
Brewing and science, cool.
Yeah.
Seltzer, obviously, this book is brand new and is tearing up the brewing charts. What spurred you on to decide to write a book about making hard seltzer?
Money.
The same reason the brewers want to make hard seltzer, right?
Yeah, exactly. I had been contracted to write the science and brewing book, and I was about maybe a fifth of the way through that, a fourth, well into it. And because I was posting, a reasonable amount of writing every week I was checking in with my contact at Brewers Publication, and they knew I wrote quickly. They contacted me and said, "Hey, we need a book like yesterday. Can you do it?" And I said, "Sure." And so yeah, it wasn't that I have any driving passion for hard seltzers. It was just I'm a writer. I enjoy writing about brewing, especially techniques in brewing, and this was an opportunity to write about an interesting topic, technique-wise, certainly, and one that I think a lot of commercial brewers need right now to generate revenue, and I think a reasonable amount of home brewers are interested in it just due to the technical challenges.
And that is the interesting piece about it. It is not easier to do, like, as much as some people may decry that it is just, simply fermenting sugar and making some ethanol, producing a clean and good tasting hard seltzer is actually far more difficult, I think, than brewing a good batch of beer. So you, as a writer, how'd you set about figuring out this process? Obviously, as we've done the same on the magazine side, and put writers on this beat. But brewers, professional brewers that are working in this space, tend to be a little more tight-lipped about their process around seltzer making than they are about brewing. Obviously, it's a very quickly evolving, field. Folks are figuring out new approaches. There's new equipment coming onto the market all the time to kind of enable this, and so these processes are evolving, as are preferences from consumers. Talk to me a little bit about your process of digging in and researching and figuring out and understanding how these things are being made commercially.
In my 20 years or so of writing about beer and brewing, I'd made a number of contacts, and also Christy Switzer, who's the publisher at Brewers Publication, put me in touch with some people. So I talked with a number of people on the record, and I spoke with several people, who said, "This is off the record. Don't mention my name with this," just through contacts. And I kept interviewing people, just kept asking the same dumb question over and over, like didn't presume that anyone knew what the other one was doing and how they approached it. And I got to a point where, the book was maybe 7/8 done. And I kept thinking, like, oh God, I hope this is right. I hope this is like, I haven't just hooked onto a few people who are doing it some weird oddball way. But luckily at right about then, the CBC had a Craft Brewers Conference, did their conference online this year, and they had a panel on hard seltzers, and they got up there and went through, and it was basically, everything just confirmed everything that I had. And so I was like, okay, I'm on the right path here. And I had some added stuff that they didn't cover. So yeah, it was just talking to a lot of people in the know, including some people I can't mention, but who have been involved in making sort of IRC malt beverages, for a long time, and from the early years of making them, and then current people making them, including I had an extensive conversation with a guy from Alaskan Brewing, because he, Christy Switzer, my contact at Brewers Publication, used to work at Alaskan Brewing, and so there's he was a major reference, and I talked to Ashton Lewis, who's at Brewer Supply Group. He was a major reference, and then I talked with people who there's a guy selling, whose name I forget right now, but he sells like kits to craft brew, like a brew pub, like you want to brew 7 barrels of hard seltzer, and he sells a kit that's like the yeast and the required yeast nutrients, and you add the sugar, you add the flavors, but as we'll surely get into, the balance of yeast and yeast nutrients is the key to the whole thing.
For sure. Let's dig in and start talking about some of the fundamentals, for those that are interested in making their own hard seltzer. Before we do that, this episode is brought to you by Mountain Rose Herbs, purveyors of the highest quality organic herbs, spices, and teas. Whether you want to add depth to your next golden triple with classic notes of cinnamon, pepper, and clove, or artfully layer exotic, zesty grains of paradise into a perfect ale, adding botanicals to your brewing is an easy way to customize a delicious flavor profile. profile. Mountain Rose Herbs has been providing organic herbs and spices to chefs, herbalists, and dedicated brewers for more than 3 decades. Learn more at mountainroseherbs.com and get 10% off your first order with the code CRAFTBEER10. Also, Grandstand is your source for the latest trends in branded drinkware, apparel, and promotional items. They make your job easy by serving as your one-stop shop for everything you need to outfit your taproom and fans. Current trends include to-go drinkware, tie-dyed prints, and portable coolers, of course, everything to take beer out of a brewery these days. Visit egrandstand.com/lookbook to see what's trending. So, say I am a brewer, professional or a home brewer, and I want to get started making my own hard seltzer. I mean, I have a rough idea obviously I've got some experience brewing. I understand the kind of beer process. From your research and what you've learned from pros that are doing this well, what are some of the most fundamental key things to pay attention to? Where do you get started, and where are those kind of points of difference from the brewing process that those interested in making hard seltzer should pay special care with?
Yeah, certainly anyone who's a professional brewer has or should have the skill sets under their belt to produce these. The basic way they're produced is you make a sugar wash, you ferment that, then you clean it up, which is different from beer. You generally don't attempt to strip flavors and colors and aromas from beer, though you do in hard seltzers. And then at the end, you blend it all together. You put in the flavor, which is just a little bit. You may accentuate that with a little acid, and most are back sweetened very lightly. Hard seltzers, if you haven't had them, they're not sweet. They're not like Zima or anything.
And in fact, that low calorie approach is one of the primary consumer drivers for it, a reason that people make them, because they are lower in sugar, lower calorie, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, the industry has somehow, they haven't done it, but the consumers have convinced themselves that it's healthy, and the industry is not trying to disabuse people of that
right
nature. And
the 20 fewer calories that they have is so much better for you.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think it was at the CBC conference I learned this, is that people have done taste tests where they add progressively more sugar to different seltzers and progressively more of the flavoring. And people always like it. And then they tell them the calories, and then their preference goes back down to the one that tastes like TV static, essentially, to Ashton Lewis's phrase.
And that is, if there's one thing that, consumer studies in, packaged goods and beverages has always shown, it's that people always prefer sweeter. Even if they say they don't, they do. And I think you're right. It is just that consciousness, but then show them a label that shows them 90 calories versus 110, and they'll convince themselves that they want the 90 calorie thing a little bit more than that. Let's first talk about sugar sources. There are, typically, what are the primary sugar sources that folks making hard seltzer are looking to?
Yeah, this is the easy part. Basically, sucrose, table sugar, widely available, cheap. That's what most of them are made from. You can also buy glucose, which is also called dextrose, same thing. And those are together, though, overwhelmingly like what they're made of. You could go find other sources of sugar if you wanted to, but it's probably going to be more expensive, and it doesn't end up with any sugar flavor. All you're doing is providing a carbon source for the yeast. So yeah, just plain old sucrose, table sugar, and or glucose, corn sugar.
And then there's a process of hydrating this and mixing it, and obviously gravity that people are going to do that to is going to vary depending on what their goals are with the product. Where do you find most commercial brewers are looking at for in terms of starting, finishing gravities, or just overall ABV for their hard seltzers?
Commercial brewers brew this at high gravity. They make a strong sugar wash, and then after cleaning it up, dilute it down to working strength. And basically, it varies. It's going to depend on, they're going to want to brew something so that when they dilute it down, it dilutes to an even number of tanks for them. So just the physical, if they have these aren't real actual
Sure,
size, but
sure.
just for if they have two 5-barrel tanks and then one 5-barrel fermenter, they're going to want to make like a 10% ABV solution so they can fill those two at 5% if that's what they're making. So their setup influences that. Their also just their ability to ferment that amount of sugar. The higher you go, the slower it goes, the more finicky the yeast are. So and the more potentially the more cleanup you do. So they try to ferment as high of a gravity sugar wash as they can get away with and fits in their brewery. And for 18 to 22 bricks is what a lot of them at least shoot for. Some of them just maybe end up a little bit lower than that for any of a number of circumstances. But they definitely ferment at high. Commercially they ferment at high gravity and dilute it down. Some brew pubs do it at just because they don't have that they're not set up
Right.
for high gravity brewing. They don't have especially you need the deaerated water. So a lot of brew pubs ferment at working strength, which helps immensely with the amount of cleanup you need to do, because if you can ferment something at 4 or 5% alcohol, it's not going to have a lot of esters. It's it's just going to be a lot easier to handle.
And for homebrewers at home with multiple carboys, it's a great way to get more hard seltzer out of a single brew day. Let's talk about water going in, and before we get into the whole yeast question, from your talks, how does water chemistry play into the kind of formation of hard seltzer, versus that in beer?
Yeah, it's really not. In brewing, you have there's a lot of details about water chemistry, how the pH that gets established in the mash due to your various mineral contents, and in hard seltzer, all you're doing is diluting sugar. So your water chemistry in one sense, doesn't play a large role. In the other sense, because the product is basically water, there's not a lot of strong flavors, whatever. It needs to taste good. So the primary thing is cleaning up any chlorine compounds, just as a brewery would anyway. So, carbon filtration. For home brewers, you may maybe add a Camden tablet to your water, and that'll take care of the monochloramines. And then, I would recommend brewers at any scale taste their water and see what it tastes like, because that's, you're not brewing a strongly flavored water, or beverage that flavors can hide behind. So taste your water, and you might need to, if you've got a very low mineral content, extremely soft water, you might want to add some calcium chloride or some gypsum or something, just like they do in a lot of packaged drinking waters, that just to make the taste better. But yeah, there's not a lot of worrying about. Well, there's one aspect I'm sure we'll get into, but there's not a ton of worry about the mineral content in your water. If you get the chlorine out of it and it tastes good, there's 90% of the battle.
Sure. And then let's talk about yeast. I mean, this is a pretty important one, especially if you start talking about high gravity brewing. You're looking for a yeast strain. We'll talk about cleanup after this. And obviously you're trying to come out with as neutral a fermentation profile as possible, but you're also looking for an effective fermentation that can handle this much sugar. And then, of course, you're trying to make sure that these yeast can actually live in this pure sugar, no nutrient environment and continue to do what they do. So talk to me about, some of the primary strategies around yeast that brewers are using with hard seltzers. And then, of course, how you keep it alive and how you keep pushing it into, handling these higher gravity brews.
When you mix up the sugar wash, it's sugar and water, and that's it. So the yeast have a carbon source, but nothing else. So every brewer who's brewed it successfully, you've got to add yeast nutrients. You got to add a nitrogen source, which can be DAP, diammonium phosphate. Urea is another one, and that'll add strictly nitrogen. And then you also need to add a blend of nutrients, and there are a lot of yeast and other brewer supply companies that manufacture some sort of blended yeast nutrient, which is usually a mix of DAP, sometimes urea. There's a lot of yeast holes in it, which is just ground up yeast. So there's, an endless number of compounds in that. A lot of them will also, zinc is something that brewers yeast is a hog for, at least relatively. And some of them will also add amino acids and some vitamins. And so anyway, you've got to make your sugar wash is initially nutrient poor, and you have to make it adequate for the yeast you're using. And what most breweries do is first they try their house yeast to see if they can get it to work, because obviously they've got a source of their house yeast, and switching to another yeast and having to maintain two cultures and worry about cross contamination, all that is a pain. So most breweries start out seeing if they can get their house yeast to work, and generally if it's fairly attenuative and it has a high alcohol tolerance, they just so current experience is fun, but there's a fair amount, fairly large swath of yeast strains from the whole spectrum that do pretty good under the right circumstances. I mean, you need to mess with the pitching rate. You need to vary your aeration. You have to try different yeast nutrients. It's I've taken more than one message from commercial brewers who just jumped in and tried to start out at a production batch, and it was like nothing's happening. And one thing in the book I highly recommend, if you're a commercial brewer, brew some pilot batches. Start at, even if you have to go out and buy a simple home brewing kit and do it at a 5-gallon scale, get something ballpark first. And then, if you have a small pilot system there, that's, a couple of barrels or something, then get it to work there, and before you jump to your 30, 40 barrel system, because people have a lot of trouble getting these fermentations to go. It's not rocket science once you get down to it. If you add between 250 and 300 parts per million free amino nitrogen, that's like 90% of the battle, especially if you couple that with, some yeast holes and stuff. But fine tuning it is something even production brewers who are, already have cans on the shelf, they still talk about, they're still tweaking the variables. Cause for them, if they can tweak it so the fermentation finishes a day earlier than it normally does, that's money in the bank. So, I've forgotten what the question was. Now I'm just rambling.
Oh, no. I so I have some questions about that.
Oh, it was yeast strains. Right?
So we're talking about yeast strains, and there are different ways of doing that. I mean, I imagine there are brewers that are making this with even like California ale, and some of these they can attenuate well, they have a constant supply of from other. Are there any in terms of effectiveness? How are there other yeast strains that others have found to be say wine yeast strains, or others that are more high gravity tolerant and work quickly that that you found brewers move to over time, or are there specific techniques using some of these brewing yeasts that they have found to work that they just continue to stick with because they have that constant yeast supply?
It's all over the map.
Sure.
At least from people I've talked to. I would say if you're a home brewer, take a page from mead makers and try Lalvin D47 or Lalvin EC-1118. Those are two white wine strains that mead makers use a lot. And making mead has a lot of similarities to making a hard seltzer, because with mead, you start with a sugar and water mixture, very low free amino nitrogen. It's not zero, but it's low, and you have some similar problems. You have some dissimilar problems too, and that honey, when you mix it up, has already a low pH, and sometimes the fermentation can drive it low. But in a hard seltzer, you've got a mixture of sugar and water, and sugar it's not an acid, it's not a base, it's not even a buffer. You start out at a high pH, and in fact, most commercial brewers adjust their pH down to basically what wort pH is at the beginning, just because they're using beer yeast, and it helps them their yeast acclimate. So if you're a home brewer, knock your pH of your sugar wash down to about 5, and that'll help your yeast get off to a little bit faster start. It's not critical actually. Once the yeast hit the sugar water, they'll start producing lactic acid like they always do. And given that there's no buffers in the system except for the yeast holes, but they're not added at any. There's amino acids in the yeast which are buffers, but not really enough to do anything.
Right.
And then the pH is just going to start dropping once you start fermenting.
Have you found any brewers that are, kind of feeding fermentables into the fermentation after it started, or staggering that kind of sugar wash so that, to, basically produce like less, shock on the yeast dealing, in that high sugar environment from the start? I mean, I know, especially talking to folks like the brewery who are brewing, Black Tuesday at 20% beer, they are feeding that fermentation as they go in order to, keep the yeast functioning and growing and basically propping it up. Do you find brewers in this kind of sector doing the same thing, or is it, say at a 10%, goal, is that not going to destroy your yeast from the outset?
I haven't found anyone who at least would admit to doing that.
Yeah.
I mentioned it in the book and go through some calculations for, if you want to, start out by fermenting something that would be 10% ABV if you're shooting for 12, and, let it ferment down to, 20%, get rid of some of the sugar, then add that back. That's something that, is used in brewing very big beers. It's used in winemaking sometimes. And mead making. But I'm not aware of any commercial brewers, at least anyone that I can point to and say, this is exactly what they do.
How important is temperature in this whole process? I mean, I imagine you're still going to clean up afterwards, but your goal is to produce the cleanest possible fermentation you can, so you have as little cleanup work to do afterwards. And then that becomes a balance between, time effectiveness, yeast health, and temperature and stress. Are there some happy places that the brewers have found to kind of, position within that overall spectrum?
Well, if you're using brewer's yeast, as we all know, brewer's yeast is fairly sensitive to temperature when it comes to ester production, much more so than wine yeast generally. If you're a brewer, you want to run your fermentation sort of at the middle to low end of the temperatures, the temperature range for that yeast, simply because you don't want a bunch of esters or anything else, acetaldehyde, in your fermented sugar wash in your base beverage. If you use wine yeast, there's a little less. It's less critical, although you don't want to run them, flat out at super high temperatures. You might be able to do that with a distiller's yeast, and interestingly enough, for reasons doing with distilling mostly, I think, you can buy distiller's yeast that comes packaged with enough yeast nutrients in it to go through a fermentation. So that's like an easy route if you don't want to, use your own yeast and do all the fine tuning. Some of these distiller's yeast are meant to be pitched into just sugar and to do the job.
I'm sure some of the pros that you've talked to have some interesting stories of some of the challenges that they've kind of faced and overcome during these fermentations. I want to ask you about that in a second. But first, Abe Beverage Equipment provides complete brewing and packaging solutions worldwide. Whether you're just starting out or looking to expand, Abe offers brew houses, tanks, canning lines, and more for small to medium-sized brewers. Abe has equipped over 1,000 breweries worldwide and has the best customer service in the industry. Call Abe Beverage Equipment at 402-475-BEER or visit abeequipment.com to learn more. That's abeequipment.com for complete brewing and packaging solutions. Also, Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions give you a year of the print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, a special deep dive email only for All Access subscribers, premium content, and All Access exclusive merchandise. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button to join now. And you can also read occasional stories in Craft Beer and Brewing magazine from my guest, Chris, right here, which we have to get you back in the magazine sometime again soon. soon. It's been a few issues, Chris.
Yeah.
Let's talk about I won't call them horror stories, but let's talk about some of the common challenges that you found brewers encounter, and how some of the stories you may have heard and some of the strategies that those brewers have used to overcome some of those challenges, in that kind of fermentation process.
Yeah, I think a lot of the brewers would call them horror stories. If you've got, one full, fermentation vessel in your brewery that's full, and the gravity is just isn't dropping. That's, that's a
That's a
scary.
sleepless night right there for you, or a few of them.
That's a scary proposition. And the overwhelming hard problem, or the overwhelming problem with hard seltzers is the fermentation. I mean, everything else is once you the cleanup is, there's some technical stuff with that, but and once you get to there, then it's just mixing things together. It's like almost at that point literally like making a cocktail.
Less
But
time pressure. Keep fix. Just keep working on it until it's right. Right.
yeah, just make a small, a series of what do they call that?
Yeah, we can talk about cleanup in a second. I
Yeah.
want to, talk to me about some of those, the stall stories, and then, are there strategies the brewers have used to then pull those things back around?
Yeah, you've got a couple options, and it sort of depends on how far the the fermentation has gone. And it's happened. I've heard brewers say, they started it and just almost nothing happened. And others that it got two-thirds of the way through installed, and it depends on how much attention they paid to yeast nutrients at the beginning. And there's a lot of things you can do, just like in brewing. One of the things is if for a commercial brewery, if they have the ability to stir the tank, rouse the yeast into suspension, that helps a lot of times. As a home brewer, you can just take your cargo boy and swirl it around, letting the temperature raise a couple degrees, up to raise it all the way up to, or maybe even a couple degrees above the recommended temperature range of that yeast, especially if it's most of the fermentation is done, because you're going to get a lot of esters at the tail end. If you've completely botched it and nothing's going on, there might be a good time to add yeast nutrients and add fresh, pump, 10% of the volume out of your tank, and either make up fresh or get that volume of sugar wash fermenting, and then pump it into your tank and get it to go. Couple things not to do are aerate late. If you aerate late, the yeast are gonna dump a bunch of diacetyl out, but since they're on the tail end of the fermentation, they aren't going to reabsorb it all like they normally do. And also adding yeast nutrients, late in the game. Some brewers do the staggered nutrient addition, which became, sort of popularized at least for home brewers through mead making. But you don't want to add yeast nutrients very late in the fermentation, because if those stick around, and they, depending on what you do for cleanup, especially if you do a tight filtration, they shouldn't. But you don't want anything that can act as a food source for contaminants in your beverage at the end. So adding yeast nutrients late is not a good idea. Yeah. So basically, stir the tank, rouse the yeast, raise the temperature a little bit, add, take out some and add in some strongly fermenting sugar wash. And another thing to check is the pH. Yeast really start to struggle, especially a lot of brewers' yeast, at lower pH. And for a lot of them, 3.5 is sort of a tipping point. If the pH has gone below that, raise it up. Just baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, is going to absorb some of the acids and raise the pH. And in that case, you would want to raise it like just barely enough to get the fermentation started. You don't want to zip it all the way back up to 5, because you want it to should finish at a fairly low pH, because most of these are canned at a pH of about 3.1, which is They're not, if you've ever had a hard seltzer, they're not sour, but they've got a little bit of a, you call it zing or whatever, or there's a crispness to them that comes from having a fairly low pH. It's in the sort of in the ballpark of what a white wine finishes at. It's lower than a beer. And no, I lost my train of thought.
That's all right.
Just going off on a tangent.
In terms of yeast pitch rates, are they generally equivalent to what you'd pitch into wort, higher, lower?
Most breweries pitch at about the normal rate for their yeast, and then they're doing it high gravity, so they're doing their beer high gravity, and so they've got the yeast pitching rate work for that. If a brewery does it at their normal strength, if they ferment beers, real beers at normal working gravity, then they're going to have to fiddle with their pitching rate. But usually the standard like ale rate of it's usually quoted as 1 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato. That holds generally, and then breweries obviously they're not all on that exact, right. And you can if you understand that most of the byproducts that have any sort of flavor consequence, like esters, get produced during yeast growth, not during fermentation. Pitching a little bit more yeast to start with, not don't go nuts, but pitching a little more yeast is going to cut down on the growth phase and get you into fermentation faster and cut down on that. There are brewers, of course, when something's good, like adding yeast nutrients helps, or adding more yeast, people have, of course, have overdone it, and they found there's problems with excessive yeast growth that the yeast end up dying and contributing off flavors to the sugar wash, which you don't want. So, normal pitching rate, a little bit higher, aeration rate, keep it, in line with what you usually do, usually 6 to 8 parts per million oxygen. And, between that and the yeast nutrients, you should get a good fermentation. But it's interesting in that you've really got to get all your ducks in a row. Like in home brewing, you boil your wort. You don't need to worry about yeast nutrients. You don't, people have all sorts of, half-assed ways of aerating their wort, and people, don't really have any, don't try to take any control over their pitching rate. And generally beer works out, hey, I made beer, right. But if you try to do a hard seltzer that way, you're just going to fail. I mean, just flat out, there's no hope. You've got to get the yeast nutrients, you got to get the aeration, you got to get your pitch rate right. And then, if you ballpark it, like start with a recipe or start with the recommendations in my book, you're still like, if you're going to go into production, like you're going to brew this over and over and over, you're still going to need to find out exactly, you're going to have to tweak your variables with the exact yeast you're using, the exact, aeration you're using, and the other factors, pH and all that.
Let's talk about cleanup for a second. Obviously now you've got this fermented hard seltzer base. You move into that phase of wanting to kind of strip out any of the kind of fermentation characters, so that you're really just pushing out almost pure ethanol water kind of solution. What are the common methods and what are for filtration and for that kind of cleanup process? What are the kinds of things the brewers should be paying attention to as they start moving through that process? Yeah,
as a home brewer, a nice thing about homebrewing a hard seltzer and doing it at sort of working gravity is you might be able to skip that phase. You just cold crash it, and you're not selling, or hopefully not selling your beverages, or if you are, you're running afoul of the law. But and if you look at it and it looks basically clear and acceptable to you, you can skip that. And as a home brewer, or even as a brew pub brewer, you could try fining. If you start with a PVPP, polyvinyl something, I forget the whole name, but sold under, a lot of homebrew shops sell it as polyclar AT, or there's also polyclar and some other designators, but polyclar AT is one used or sold in a lot of homebrew shops. If you fine with that, and then you follow it up with fining with activated carbon, which is sometimes sold as enological carbon. You can clean up a homebrewed beverage or even one at a brew pub, very well. You should note, especially if you're a brew pub brewer, that carbon makes a big mess. You're going to have a black sludge at the bottom of your fermentation vessel. If you're a home brewer, it's not that big deal. Just wash it out. But it's more of a deal if you're brewing commercially and time is money, and you can't have a mess everywhere. Craft like brew pub brewers also, if you could rig up like a Grant that had a bed of activated carbon and recirculate through it, that's another way to go. Big breweries, of course, or if we skip to the biggest breweries, they'll do like nanofiltration or reverse osmosis or something to clean these up. But for normal, or what as a craft brewer would think of normal production size breweries, a lot of them, they just use their plate filtration system, clean it up as you normally would with a beer, and then do a filtration through activated carbon. And that, and there's plates that go into the plate filters that most of these brewers already have. And basically the thickness of the carbon filter is going to determine how much character gets scrubbed out of the sugar wash. And you're shooting to remove any off odor, any off color, and any off flavor. And they all the places that supply breweries now have, given the craze, sell the filters and tell you the various grades and what they do. One interesting thing, if you've mostly cleared something up, or at the end of fermentation, if only odor is the problem, if there's no off flavors and no off colors, or at least not to your liking, you can bubble CO2 through the solution, and that will take care of the problem as well. That's especially for homebrewers. That might be something that if you've it looks basically clear but look basically nice, but has some just like some estery aroma. You might try just bubbling CO2 through it. Just hook your normal aeration stone instead of hooking it to an oxygen tank to aerate. Hook it to your CO2 tank. One thing to be wary of, though, or be aware of, is right after fermentation, your sugar wash is going to be saturated with carbon dioxide. If you just turn it on, a bunch of bubbles at once, they're going to just, it's going to well up, and you're going to be cleaning hard seltzer off your ceiling. So, yeah. So start slow. Probably, I would sanitize a mash paddle or something if you got a stainless steel one, or a big spoon. Stir a little while, just knock some of the CO2 out of solution, and then when you start out, just crack the regulator. Just start out as slowly as you can, and let it wait till you see bubbles coming. That made the whole trip from the top to the bottom very slowly, and then start adjusting up if you need. And then just while you're doing it, if you're homebrewer, just swirl the vessel, and it should take care of. You just take samples as you go, and once the problem's taken care of, stop.
Oxygen is not as crucial a thing to pay attention to then at that phase. Am I reading you right? Obviously, there's not as many volatile compounds in this kind of base as there might be in a beer, and so not the same kind of level of spoilage possible from oxygen ingress. But how much attention should a brewer pay to it? So given that most brewers are hyper cautious about those kinds of things.
Yeah, and with good reason. Like beer has a relative lot of like fatty acids and things left over in it. It's not a majority, but there's enough in it that if oxygen is present, these turn into compounds such as trans 2-nonanol that are staling, and there's basically there's none of that in a hard seltzer. There's very little that can be staled by oxygen. Although once you have the flavors, that changes a bit.
Right.
So they still, when brewers dilute it to working strength, they still use deaerated water. Probably in part because if they brew high gravity beers already, they're already set up to do it, and that's already the protocol. So why change? But yeah, you should be care if you're doing any kind of dilution, you should be careful with oxygen. And if you're as a home brewer, you don't want to splash it around excessively. But the worries of a hard seltzer going stale are a good step less than they are with beer, just because the sort of compounds that go stale in beer aren't present in a hard seltzer.
And you do make a good point that any oxygen you then introduce at that point can later impact the kind of flavors that you add into it and then create a future problem, even if it's not a problem at the time that you're, kind of processing around that. Let's use that segue and talk a little bit about then adding flavor into hard seltzer. Generally, no one likes unflavored hard seltzer. I haven't seen anyone release just straight unflavored hard seltzer. I could be wrong, and I'm sure someone will email me and correct me on this after the podcast airs. But the sector is defined in a lot of ways by the kind of common hard seltzers, LaCroix and others that are common regular seltzers, that people consume. And those generally using light essences, for flavoring. From your discussions with, professional brewers where, and I shouldn't say this, we're starting to see a broader spectrum now in the hard seltzer space. And, if I look at the last 18 months of hard seltzers that, the various brewers have sent us, for kind of review and feedback and everything else, like, we see everything from perfectly bright and clear, lightly essenced seltzers with minimal flavor, and that kind of high LaCroix carbonation to now hazier, murkier, real fruit conditioned seltzers. That are still relatively low in sugar, and then all the way into that kind of hard seltzer is kind of pseudo canned cocktail used with a sweeter approach, also hazy or no real, or a color and body that is driven by flavor and ingredients more than it is by an end goal for a consumer expectation about clearness and brightness. And so there is this broader spectrum, but from your conversations with brewers, let's talk to me a little bit about that kind of range of ways that brewers are pushing these flavors in. And then one thing I'm curious about is especially with essence being a primary flavor driver on the lighter side of seltzer. Talk to me about solubility and how brewers make sure that these flavor ingredients can and do remain in suspension in these.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there have been some blank hard seltzers released. White Claw had a version.
Okay.
And some, I don't see a lot of them on the shelves. I don't think they're super popular, but they exist at least. Although, right now, as you said, the spectrum of different hard seltzers is definitely increasing, there was sort of the classic hard seltzer, and then came the higher alcohol ones, then came the slightly higher sugar ones, or the ones flavored with stevia, and now they're all over the board. Commercially, most of the flavors, they just buy commercial flavor extracts, and as a commercial brewer, you have to worry about all sorts of TTB and FDA regulations.
Sure.
And the nice thing, though, is, of course, the manufacturers are more than aware of this, and if you buy their flavoring, they have all the numbers and reporting, and most flavors have ethanol in them, and as a commercial brewer, you have to account for that in your alcohol estimates. And so there, for commercial brewers, they use the highly concentrated commercial extracts that are used, in the food industry. A nice thing about home brewing is you can use natural. You can use juices. You can use soda pop, not a natural thing, but easy. You can use you can make tinctures of things. You can take an empty spice vial and put something that you want to flavor your hard seltzer within, and then cover it with like vodka and let it sit for a week and just make a flavor concentrate. As a home brewer, not having to worry about FDA labeling or TTB approval, you can get away with a lot of things, and you can do a nice thing about home brewing is you can make, if you wanted to, you can make a hard seltzer that actually tasted good. If you don't care about the calories, add enough add enough, it doesn't need to be,
Yeah.
sweet to the point of Zima, but you could add something sweet to the point where it tasted pretty good, and you could add enough, you know, uh, add enough of whatever flavoring, you can use, you could use actual limes instead of, artificial lime flavoring. You could use cranberry juice. You could use, uh, you could use cider. There's,
Right.
the hard seltzers have shied away from making apple flavors, probably because they don't want to blur the line between that and cider. Same with grape. So as a homebrewer, you have uh, a wide variety of options that you can explore that would be either not possible or less financially viable for a commercial brewer. And about solubility and keeping it in suspension, I haven't heard anything about that being a problem. I mean, I would yeah, I shouldn't say anything because I don't know anything about that.
No, fair enough, fair enough. No, and I imagine since we're talking about, commercial, flavor formulations and companies that are specifically selling these to commercial breweries in order to do that, then they've solved some of those solubility and, kind of
Yeah,
suspension issues and, specifically designed products for that. No, it's funny. I actually, we owned a beer bar a number of years ago for about a year. I kept thinking at the time, like, if I could get some unflavored, malt base that we could then, pre-mix, quote unquote, cocktails in, and then
hmm
serve them off of tab, that'd be a great, kind of strategy for, for a venue that didn't have a liquor license or couldn't serve hard alcohol to be able to serve quote unquote cocktails.
right.
And now we've got, even on a consumer spectrum, you've now got, hard seltzer makers that are basically pre-making those kinds of things and providing them out there into the market.
hmm
Let's talk a little bit about finishing the hard seltzer, and a primary component of that that may be overlooked or not thought about as much as it should be is carbonation. This is a bright and a zippy drink, and if you start talking about the not, the regular seltzers that people consume and that kind of create the consumer expectation for seltzer in general, they're all generally highly carbonated. In your discussions with brewers, where are they kind of, aiming at for carbonation for these, in order to provide that kind of, experience on the palate while people are drinking them?
Yeah, the standard for hard seltzers, at least the 4 to 5% alcohol ones that gain popularity, is around 2.8 volumes of CO2. This is higher than most American craft beers, and American pilsners are right around 2.5, 2.6. So it's higher than that. It's lower than German Hefeweizens, which are Weissen beers are. Those are a lot of times 4 to 5 volumes of CO2, and it's definitely less than like champagne, which can range up to 6 volumes of CO2. But they're spritzy, and the ones that are packaged in cans are generally right around 2.8. A lot of brew pubs go with their normal carbonation level just because they don't want to rebalance their whole draft system to accommodate that one beverage, and that's fine. And again, as a home brewer, you're free to do whatever you want. You can, if you want to make one with 5 volumes of CO2, go ahead and do it. But commercially, 2.8 volumes of CO2 is what's added, and that adds just a nice like zip or zing or whatever you want to call it. And in conjunction, especially with a lot of these, most of the flavors for nearly all of the flavors that show up are fruit flavors. There's some herbs and some stuff, but a lot of those are even go along with a fruit flavor. And so a little bit of acid a lot of times is added, either like citric acid if you're making like lime or grapefruit, which are two of the most popular flavors, or orange or lemon. Adding a little more citric acid sort of sharpens up the little flavor that you do have. If you're going with anything else, cherry, peaches, all those other stone fruits, a little malic acid, which is the sometimes called the apple acid. It's, when you bite into a Granny Smith apple, and there's that acidic crunch to those apples, that the acidic thing, that's malic acid. So that's added to sharpen up the flavor and also to drive the pH down to about 3.1, because at that level there's sort of, you've reached a level of biological stability that very, few contaminants are going to be able to live in a 4 or 5% ethanol solution with, at a pH of 3.1. So, yes, that's
Cool. We're starting to get long on time here. If there is a piece of advice that you may not have shared with a brewer professional or home brewer interested in making their own hard seltzer, what would that be?
do do test batches. Start small. If you're a home brewer, even if you're a commercial brewer, line up every gallon jug you have, and you know, start with yeast nutrients. Make a half gallon, 3/4 of a gallon of sugar wash and put it in the 1 gallon jugs, and same amount of yeast in everyone, same amount of aeration, and then start adding between 250 and 300, or maybe even a little bit lower than that, uh, and see which what ferments, what doesn't, and then start with the one that fermented completely but used the least amount of yeast nutrients, and then sort of expand that out and do a smaller range. As a home brewer, that's probably overkill. You should maybe one test fleet of test batches should be enough. But as a commercial brewer, you'd want to narrow it down a little bit more, especially since the fermentation shouldn't take that long. And then, if you're a commercial brewer, step that up to if you have a pilot system, and then go into production. If you're a home brewer, take a stab with a couple 1 gallon jugs. As a home brewer, about a teaspoon of complete yeast nutrients of the type sold by, like, Y Yeast sells some, White Labs sells some. I think most of the other yeast suppliers sell some sort of thing that they label as complete yeast nutrients. About a teaspoon per gallon, and maybe try that, and maybe try like 1 and 1.2 teaspoons, and maybe try 0.8 teaspoons, and see if you can get that to ferment, and then jump to a 5 gallon batch. I mean, if worst comes to worst, you've ruined 4 pounds of sugar.
Right.
Not the end of the world. But yeah, I definitely say, I mean, the overwhelming problem that the brewers at any level have is with fermentation, and taking some time to do some smaller scale of fermentations, just to get to ballpark it at least first, and then jump to larger scales is going to be more than worth most people's time.
That makes a lot of sense. Maybe we'll finish up with I would call it $1 million question, but it's more like $1 billion question at this point. And I'll give you some background. 2 years ago, I made a bet with our co-founder of Craft Beer and Brewing, John Bolton, my business partner. And I think hard seltzer was at about $500 million in sales a year. And, we were asking the question at that point, like, is this cider? Has this now hitting a plateau where it doesn't grow any further? And I think I put $100 bet on the plateau, and he's like, absolutely nope, you're wrong. And and then at the end of last year, I had to pay him out. Although I think I pushed that bet forward, and I think we doubled or nothing on this year. And oh my God, and it just continues. And now I think we're over $1.5 billion in revenue for the entire commercial hard seltzer category in the United States. From your perspective, and in conversations with brewers and looking at their bullishness or bearishness on it, where do you think the future of hard seltzer looks like? Is this a continued growth? Are we starting to hit a plateau? Is this going to be like Zima, a quick trend that hits and then disappears? What is the consensus, and how do you personally feel about that?
I don't really have any personal thoughts about it. I don't care one way or the other.
Yeah.
But the industry sure is betting on it growing. When hard seltzers were first introduced, or at least the first big wave, when White Claw became available and people started drinking it, it got pegged early as, this is something that millennial females are going to drink in the summer, and that's it. But over time, very, very quickly, they showed that males and females were buying in roughly equal amounts, which is weird in fermented beverages. Beer is strongly skewed towards males, whereas wine is skewed somewhat towards females. But hard seltzer is almost dead on 50-50, at least the last I heard. and also it started out as like, a Broham drink for, Instagram followers. And so it was tightly associated with millennials at first, but the demographics have, the age curve has just been slowly expanding year after year. The resale statistics are going up. If people try it, they're very likely, compared to other things, to buy it again. And just basically every prediction against it, which were mostly made by people who liked beer and made the vast mistake of thinking that the flavor or lack thereof of hard seltzers was going to be some sort of impediment to their sales, which they're not. I mean, they're made or break right now, or made or broken right now on the idea that they're somewhat more healthy. They're lower in calories. A lot of them advertise being gluten-free. A lot of them advertise low carbohydrates, which ties into a bunch of fad diets like what is it, the South Beach diet and
keto
all
and
those. Keto and all sorts of dumb stuff. And so I don't have any personal stake into it, except for wanting to sell my book. Available today through Brewers Publications. And but the industry certainly is banking, like they're building new breweries specifically for these, and a lot of craft breweries are jumping on the bandwagon. And even a lot of them, interestingly enough, are like, there's a lot of talk in the beginning about craft breweries brewing these, but then branding them as something else and then having the name of their brewery in tiny print somewhere, to fulfill legal obligations. But a lot of breweries are just putting them out as the brewery branded and then hard seltzer. Yeah. Bud Light hard seltzer, which when you think about it, makes no sense. It's not, Bud Light is a kind of beer, and now you're saying it's but breweries are willing to slap their names on them now.
We're seeing more of these mixed packs where breweries are mixing in their hard seltzers along with their beer even.
Really?
I'm seeing a few of those out there. And so, I think the hard and fast lines or the kind of brand separation that we might have predicted around that it's getting a lot more messy and complex than we might have thought it would. And, having said that, like, we've tasted some really good ones. I put my professional credibility at risk when I say it, but there are certainly some hard seltzers out there. Now, we've had plenty that.
Which ones did you like?
We did an editor's pick 2 issues ago in Craft Beer and Brewing, and where Joe and I tasted through a whole bunch of seltzers, and some really fascinating ones. Untitled Art and their Florida seltzer line is, they've given up that purely bright approach, and they're using real fruit puree in order to, and it produces a hazier, seltzer, but there's a beautiful fruit component to it. And if you're into that kind of agua fresca, wanting something refreshing but light and very much fruit flavored, not a bad seltzer at all. Boulevard's Quirk seltzers are some of the best in the game. They're not perfectly bright, but they're not hazy either. But there is just an interesting directness to the fruit flavor that without having a high sugar approach that I just find really endearing. And so, there are a few others past those. We're working on our best in beer issue this year, and we've been kicking around like, how are we going to put together a list of our favorite hard seltzers? Because it just seems like something that we need for this year. But yeah, I agree with you there. It's not going away. It may not be the future of beer, but I don't think there is a future. There are many futures. And, and I think the key to success is making things that varying types of drinkers want to drink. Nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Gambrinus Rye delivers spicy, grainy, and bready notes with suggestions of vanilla and sweet dough. Mountain Rose Herbs offers the highest quality organic herbs, spices, and teas. Grandstand is your source for the latest trends in branded drinkware, apparel, and promotional items. Abe Beverage Equipment offers complete brewing and packaging solutions, and Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions are the best way to support this very podcast. Chris Colby, if people want to learn more about what you do or buy a copy of this book, which they absolutely must do if they want to make hard seltzer themselves, where do they find you? Where do they find the book?
The book's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's in bookstores too. It's an ordinary book. And for people looking for other information, there's my website, beerandwine.com or beerandwinejournal.com. And there's nothing on it about hard seltzer yet, but obviously I just put a book on that's coming. And I also think that this is brand new right now. So there's going to be new information coming out all the time. People are we're going to figure out something new. They're going to try something new. It's also possible that the commercial regulations that regulate hard seltzers right now might change, because a lot of people in the spirits industry, I think, aren't happy that now the brewing industry is basically putting out, something that's a cocktail and getting taxed at a 6% rate like brewers are, rather than the rate of, like, there are a few hard seltzers that are actually like distilled spirits added to water, but those would get taxed at a higher rate. So the taxation scheme might change, and that could change hard seltzers too, because they're one thing in the history part of the book. Like, the only point I make is that nobody asked for hard ciders. People weren't saying, I want something clear and fizzy and tasteless. It just, the TTB regulation changed that malt or that sugar could be used as a substitute for malt. And some people said, well, if we can do that, what if we did 100% sugar? And, they brewed something up and test marketed it, and it hit. So, further changes in the regulation might, spur some other beverage, which, may or may not hit. I mean, a lot of the fermented beverage industry has had a lot of flashes in the pans. There was SEMA, Mike's Hard Lemonade, Not Your Father's Red Beer, and before that, Champagne, going way back in the day, Malt Duck, if anyone's old enough to know that reference. So there's, brewers try anything, because of, that innovation has brought us, things other than Malt Duck. There's also, West Coast IPAs and that turned into double IPAs. And, we have lots of
history is being made while we drink it and while we brew it.
Yes, and changes are coming from a technical aspect of how to do what we're doing now, and new ideas. What will definitely be flowing into the collective consciousness of brewers.
Fantastic. Well, Chris, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. Really appreciate you sharing your insight and perspective on how to brew hard seltzer.
Thank you for having me on the show. Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.